Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined again by Matt Segall, Associate Professor at California Institute of Integral Studies. This is actually the third conversation between me and Matt, but it's starting to be a little bit of a series, actually, which I was really heartened. Our recent conversation just published 6 days ago, and it's already got like 1,300 views, and it seemed to have a lot of engagement. So we'd already planned for this one as a kind of natural outgrowth of that previous conversation, but there's a lot to tackle here in all this, and so I'm excited to see the kind of interest and engagement with all this. But today we're going to talk about prehension, which is something that both that naturally came up in our previous conversation. I'll set this up in a second to try to give a little bit more context. But before anything else, thank you, Matt, so much again for coming back on this podcast.
Lovely to be in this dialectical entanglement with you, Brendan.
Likewise. All right. So again, last time I tried to frame things and probably rambled for a bit, so I'll try to be a little more concise. But this is how I'm looking at this conversation, or at least this topic, which seems to be like pretty central to like you have to tackle this idea, it seems, before a lot of the other things can kind of fall into place, and you can really get some of the bigger, I think, relationships of ideas that are going on in this discussion. So that's why I felt like it warranted its sort of own conversation. But we're talking about prehension here, and I'll allow you to explain that in a second. But people familiar with, say, integral theory are going to know that term from Wilber's quadrants. He places it in the upper left, basically all the way down at the bottom, this notion that there's this kind of very primordial sense of subjectivity or interiority, I guess you could say, that goes all the way down. And the relationship, I guess, that this idea has with consciousness, with subjectivity, is really what I specifically want to get into. So I know that there's a million things that could be said about it, and I was actually watching. You've got a fantastic like hour and a half long lecture on your channel talking about this part of Whitehead's ideas. So I'd throw people over to that if they want to get some sort of broader context. But I'd love to zero in on this particular aspect of the issue of like the notion around the fundamental or primordial nature of interiority or subjectivity or mind or what have you. And we'll have to dance with some of the language here, because obviously that's a big part of what makes this a difficult topic. So that's sort of the topic. And I feel like once we can get into some of that and probe it, and hopefully I can ask you some questions, you can also just explain some of this stuff to me, because Whitehead is sometimes there's just, I read it and it's like incredibly lucid and illuminating, and other times it's very opaque and I'm like, it's flashes of luminosity, but kind of woven throughout this sort of otherwise very dense thing for me. So I find it a very challenging text, but you are very well versed, and again, that lecture that I just mentioned is sort of part of a broader conversation and kind of extended discussion that you lead on the text. So we have our resident expert here. Okay, so that all said, I'll just set it up this way, and then I'll hand it over to you. We're talking about, I would say, consciousness, subjectivity, interiority, etc. Now, I think we both very much would agree that the sort of reductionist take on this issue is just wrong. And I see there being some kind of options on the table here, right? So there's the reductionist option, and then there's what I would call sort of the emergentist option, which is that consciousness isn't fundamental, but it winds up showing up as sort of a novel phenomenon in the course of history. And then there's this sort of what I think has become increasingly popularized under the label panpsychist approach, which is that it is fundamental and it kind of goes all the way down. And a lot of people draw connections with that approach and Whitehead's view. And so, yeah, I think that you and I are going to be on the same page around all the problems with a reductionistic take on consciousness and subjectivity, and how that just becomes a bit ridiculous. And so then it seems like we have at least these two really compelling options around emergentism or panpsychism. And that's where this notion of prehension as a philosophical idea would seem to be potentially able to do some really important work. So that's basically what I'll say for now. And then I think things will come out over the course of our conversation. But then the last thing I guess I want to invite you to do is, you're obviously an incredible scholar of Whitehead, but, don't just give me Whitehead, give me Matt Segall's take on all this as someone who's sort of digested and metabolized a lot of the different ideas informed by Whitehead, but also, yeah, I'd love to kind of see where you're at with this kind of big, important issue. So, all right, I'll shut up now and set the stage a little bit more.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful invitation to explore these ideas together. I think Whitehead's cosmology it's like, you say I'm an expert, and yeah, I mean, I've been studying his ideas for a long time, like 15 years, but I'm still learning to see the world as he was seeing and trying to see it. But it is like visiting another planet. And, his books, Process and Reality, chief among them, is a kind of portal into this other universe. It's taking a journey to another planet where, human beings have come to relate to the history of the universe and its present display before them in a very different way than what both what the modern scientific view has been since the scientific revolution, but also very different from what the medieval Catholic view of it was, if we're talking about the West. Very different from what Europeans have been imagining for thousands of years. And so that's difficult work. And, prehension is probably, Charles Hartshorne, who was one of Whitehead's, not exactly students. He was already he was a teaching assistant and working on the Charles Saunders Peirce archives at Harvard when Whitehead came, but definitely, learned a lot from Whitehead. And he thought prehension was actually Whitehead's most important conceptual innovation because of the way that it bridged the experiential and the causal domains, which in modern philosophy had been so viciously separated from one another, and viciously, and to mean like, I don't, that sounds very charged, but like, this is the confounding problem that shapes all of modern philosophy is how do you get the causal domain of nature and this inner domain of human experience to relate. And there are various strategies for that. There are materialist strategies to reduce the inner to the outer. The idealist strategy is the reverse of that. And there are various kind of monisms and or pantheisms and panpsychisms and ways in which we can resolve this dichotomy in different ways. But I think, well, let's go to Wilber's map here. I think I'm glad you brought in that context where Wilber puts prehension at the bottom of the lower left quadrant as the sort of starting place for the interior domain of reality. And I think that's a very interesting placement because, and this is something I try to get into in an email too, and I turned it into a tweet later, that prehension for Whitehead is not just a subjective feeling. It's what's innovative about it. The reason Hartshorne was so excited about this is it's actually the bridge between inner and interior and exterior, inner and outer, subject and object. It's Whitehead's attempt to describe how objects become subjects and subjects become objects, and how this reciprocality, this polar dynamic between object and subject kind of is the engine of evolution and the basis of learning. And to put it just in the interior domain, I think is a mistake. And, if Wilbur were here with us, he would nuance that, and the map is not the territory and everything. But I think there's an opportunity missed to really grok what Whitehead meant by prehension when it's placed just on the interior side. It's definitely meant to be the transition between exterior and interior back to exterior, because Whitehead's whole process ontology is about how, subjects emerge from objects, he'll say, but when objects achieve the aim of their experience, moment by moment, they perish into, he calls them superjects, but that's a superject is like a subject's perspective on what it's going to become in the future. But from the next occasion's perspective, that superject is an object that becomes part of the data that feeds its subjectivity. And through these transitions from one occasion of experience to the next, mediated by prehensions, novelty is brought into the world, right? And so, Whitehead is inventing a new concept here to try to get us out of this modern bind where we just can't figure out how subject and object go together. But there's more we could go into with Wilber's, I think, attempt to sequester prehension just in the interior domain, because this leads to an interesting misinterpretation on Wilber's part, I think, when it comes to the question of intersubjectivity that he thinks is somehow profoundly lacking in Whitehead's thought. I don't know if you've read Wilber and Sean Esperon Hargens on this issue about Whitehead not really having a basis in his philosophy for intersubjectivity, and I think that's wrong. But it's based on this idea that prehension is just the interior that would lead them to make that argument.
Well, the way that you're talking about it, it makes me think more of like what John Vervaeke talks of as the transjective. There's something kind of, an umbrella category that sort of situates and relates the subjective and the objective to each other. I bring it up not so much because I think it demands some kind of clarification or belaboring, but just because, one, I think a lot of people will probably have been introduced to the term through that framework, and so that might be initially. So that's a good clarification to get, like, well, that we're not just talking about the sort of fundamental subjectivity of things, that there's a broader context in which it's a part.
Right.
So there's that aspect of it, but I also do I want to focus, I think, on that subjective side of things, right? I mean, I don't think well, part of that would be sort of just asking the question, right? Like, is it even meaningful to be relating Whitehead's thought to panpsychic conversations and to those kinds of conversations that are trying to see subjectivity or consciousness even as fundamental? I mean, would you say that is that missing anything, or is there something to that connection?
So I'm of two or maybe three minds about that. Actually, I've published and spoken publicly a lot about Whitehead as a panpsychist, but I've always wanted to differentiate between different species of panpsychism, and the basic differentiation there, I would say, is there's substance panpsychism and there's process panpsychism. Philip Goff's position is changing a little bit, which is great, but I think his original panpsychism, which was criticized as kind of like a micropsychism, and then cosmopsychism was articulated. But originally the idea that like fundamental particles would possess some subjective property, and that eventually Goff would start saying things like the content of the physical relations described with mathematics by physicists, the content would be a conscious experience. And that almost started to sound kind of idealist, actually. And so it's like, what's the difference between panpsychism and idealism at that point? But the idea of subjectivity as a property of a physical particle is very much still in that substance property metaphysics. And Whitehead's whole process-relational ontology is an attempt to think in different terms because of really what quantum physics and relativity physics was suggesting to us about the ultimate nature of reality, that it didn't make sense to think in terms of substances. And it's kind of ironic, this whole debate between Goff and Hassenfelder about whether electrons exist. And because electrons as disturbances in a field, it's like Goff wants to think of them as more like substances. And anyways, there's a difference between these kinds of panpsychism. And so I have been arguing that Whitehead is a panpsychist, and we should be thinking of him in the context of this contemporary resurgence of panpsychism as an alternative to either eliminative materialism
Mm-hmm.
or kind of emergentism, where consciousness pops
Mm-hmm.
out at some point because of properly arranged
Yeah.
physical processes. Um, but I've also been in dialogue with friends and colleagues of mine like Timothy Jackson, who has tried to lure me away from the term panpsychism because he thinks it's at this point too weighed down by the association with a kind of substance ontology. And he suggests terms like animism, but I think that has its own baggage too.
Yeah, I would
But
say that one's pretty freighted as well. I don't know if that helps.
yeah, but David Ray Griffin, the Whitehead scholar, coined this term pan-experientialism to distinguish the idea of psyche or soul going all the way down from the idea of experience, which for Whitehead is a technical term. And strictly speaking, as Whitehead uses the term consciousness, he's with the emergentists. He's with you.
Yeah, right.
Consciousness emerges because of a special arrangement of the way that historical roots of occasions of experience can become more self-reflexive, and that requires a sort of biological apparatus to support it and amplify unconscious feelings. But the whole point for Whitehead is that most experience, most feeling is not conscious.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is exactly, well, what I want to then dig into. And I think you've done a great job differentiating things, right? Because it's very easy, to just use these single terms for things. But there's like a lot of variability and plurality in this conversation space. And that it papers over a lot of differences that are can be very important conceptually. So thank you for kind of foregrounding that. I think that's important. And I'm sure some of these strands will probably come back to and be able to kind of compare and contrast and do that sort of a thing. But for me, then the big question becomes, given that that there is some relationship here of what we're talking about to this notion of the fundamental nature of feelings, experience, mind, consciousness, subjectivity, interiority, right? We've got all these terms that can mean very slightly different things, and we want to be careful about that. But just at a preliminary level, let's just use them somewhat interchangeably, and then you can maybe try to home in or hone our options here. But for me, the big question becomes, what does the spectrum of that interiority look like, right? How do we trace that back from the kind of interiority that we are familiar with as subjective, conscious human agents with a kind of complex, biological substrate and a really complex nervous system and brain going on that's mediating apparently that in some way. And I do also want to talk about the relationship, like the binding problem and all that sort of stuff. But that's what we know from our direct phenomenological experience, yes, subjectivity, consciousness, feeling, experience, right? Now, trying to track that and see how it shades down into less complex entities, ultimately to just the most primal, primordial elements in existence, and still finding some continuity there. That for me is like the big question, right? Because I want to know. And you can use kind of an extreme case, right? Like, let's just talk about, I don't know, like a gold atom, or we can even say, I don't know. We can be, I was going to say, and we'll have to deal with this as well. We're talking about heaps, right? Versus like entities, right? Is it like, we're not saying that most people wouldn't say that like, oh, a chair has this, right, as some kind of entity, as though it's it's a conglomeration, it's a series of aggregates rather than sort of a unified whole. So that's an important issue too, but let's just sideline that for a second. Question is, like, what is the continuity? What is the binding element here, the leitmotif that meaningfully connects what I think of as human subjectivity and what a gold atom may, quote unquote, experience?
I mean, in short, I think it's time. Time is what binds our experience of consciousness, which is quite, has a lot of depth and width in the sense that it's able to consider. We can think about the past going back indefinitely, We can think about the future going ahead indefinitely. We can think about space out to the edges of our best non-Euclidean geometries, and so we can. The human mind is capable of, and in terms of our own biographies, in terms of the appreciation of art and literature, it's like we don't want to naively overgeneralize human experience. But I think when you talk about time, and here it's important, I think, for me as a process philosopher, kind of, I hate to take sides, but there's this huge 20th century issue that gets, you can kind of think of it dramatized in the encounter between Einstein and Bergson about time. Like, is there something more to time that connects to our subjectivity that is important for the cosmos itself, to understand the cosmos itself? Or, I mean, that would be Bergson's position, right? Or is Einstein right that the time of human experience has nothing whatever to do with the nature of the universe? We have to totally just separate our sense of the meaning of the passage of a human life from the truth about the nature of reality, right? That would be the Einsteinian position. So I think one of the ways of understanding my own position would be to say, we have to look again at time and something that 20th century, and it started to shift actually in the 21st century, but 20th century physics, and going with the Einsteinian and the quantum view on time. I mean, time as a irreversible process of the production of novelty, where the future doesn't yet exist and is like really open. Quantum physics doesn't necessarily say that's not possible. Relativity, it seems, on most interpretations, says no, that's not how time works. But for quantum, like for the wave function, for Einstein's equations, time can go in either direction, and they work just as well. And so I think something's missing there. And if we grant that something's missing from that form of the physical sciences attempt to understand the whole universe, if there's something about time that's missing from all the approaches I've seen to a theory of everything, or a grand unifying theory, then we have to take seriously the possibility that what we think of as our subjective experience has relevance for our understanding of the world itself. So something about who we are as persons goes all the way down. Figuring out how to generalize from our experience so as not to just commit some crude anthropomorphism is not an easy problem, but it's not an impossible problem either. So, I use the metaphor of alchemical distillation in my book to talk about it's a phenomenological reduction of sorts. Can we arrive at a general account of experience that would be general enough that it's not just limited to how human beings experience time, but it also applies to electromagnetic radiation? That it also applies to our understanding of cellular behavior. And can we think about, in our attempt to understand the universe as a whole, not just about like the periodic table of elements, where it's clear, this is why Whitehead's an atomist, that nature produces wholes at every scale. Obviously at the biological scale, you have wholes with agency, but I think you have that already in atomic physics. You have that already with stars and galaxies. You have self-organizing systems that are in agent arena relationships, processing information and learning from that experience. And so I think Whitehead's wager here is that we can talk meaningfully about these physical processes as also always subjective. We can have a periodic table of elements and a periodic table of emotion. And emotion, Whitehead, when he wants to get at what a physical experience would be like what is a certain wavelength of electromagnetic energy, a pulse of electromagnetism experiencing. Whitehead thinks emotion is where the sorts of metaphors we should draw upon, because he thinks human emotion is, I mean, emotions are very vague. We have words for them, but it, for most of us, most of the time, it's very hard to describe what our mood is really like. And so emotions like joy and disgust, Whitehead thinks, actually are clues to to the most basal forms of experience that exist in the universe. And so he's a romantic at heart, right? So something like William Blake's statement that energy is eternal delight, we might want to take actually quite literally.
Yeah, but this is exactly it. And this is what I want to dissect, interrogate a little bit, try to get some clarity about. Of course, I know that detractors will be like, see, he wants to dissect and interrogate. It's a violence to the natural experience or something. But choose your metaphor what you will. I mean, I want to get some conceptual clarity. I want to illuminate this, because you're naming the potential pitfall, which is a sort of crude anthropomorphism that we're just sort of projecting ourselves onto other entities and projecting our subjectivity onto objects. And so we don't want to do that. We want to acknowledge the difference. But I then want some clarity about what words there might be that could do that, because all of our emotional words are things like joy and delight and whatnot. But all of those, obviously, when we think about that, yes, they are vague. But their vagueness, I think, comes from their incredible complexity, that, like, we're this swirling mixture of hormones and interactions of molecules and chemicals mediated by structures and, neural systems and everything, that, like, yeah, there's a lot of vagary there that comes from all the dynamic interaction of all the different parts of my body, interacting with each other in response to a very complex environment as well. So then it's like, okay, but then if you take that away, right, like a rock doesn't have a nervous system, or hormones, or blood moving through it or anything, right? It doesn't have any of that architecture. So how do we then, if these subjective qualities that we identify as our subjective experience, when you zoom in on them, you see that there are at least these correlates, right? That, like, when I talk about my experience, I'm talking about something that's correlated with brain states, that's correlated with energy going through my nervous system. And then if you just remove those correlates one by one and take them away, right, it seems that, like, what's left over for there to be this subjective basal nature to things?
Well, I mean, let's take the most scientific view we can of a rock and just zoom in there and recognize that the perception we have of it through our eyes and with our hands when we pick it up, of it being a sort of solid body, is actually totally an illusion. A rock is a swarm of molecular activity. And at that scale, there are many agencies at play, but the problem is that their agencies are not coordinated in the way that an organism would be, a massive coordination process, such that these molecular, cellular, molecular, atomic agencies have found a way to work in concert rather than work at cross purposes. In a rock, the molecular and atomic agencies at play at the microscopic scale are their individual agencies being canceled out by the chaos of their interactions. Or in the case of crystals, it's not a chaos of interaction, it's overly rigid order that gets imposed, and you can't get the dissipative structure going, where the matter is cycling through the form, right? And so it's all a matter of scale. The extent to which a rock, most obviously, as the obvious example people go to, lacks agency is obvious, but zoom in, right? Or as we talked about last time, zoom out, see the rock as part of this earth, this terrestrial process. And in the right time scale, what seems like an inert lump of stuff over there is actually caught up in a self-generating activity. Right?
Yeah, I guess, but there needs to be this sort of locus of agency, right? Like you talked about nature creating holes. And I think this is, to his credit, something that I think is really interestingly I don't know if it's innovative, but it's at least clarifying in Wilber's account of things. It's that, like, when we're talking about that prehensive consciousness, it's not occurring at the chair level or these aggregate heaps. It's occurring at these wholes levels, these holonic junctures. And so,
Mm-hmm.
for human beings, it's very clear, because like my I is a sense of my agency, and I am that networked collection of things coming together to express that. Um, and so I guess, right. So it's sort of like, even if you concede that, okay, maybe at the level of like the Gaia system, the rock is then part of a greater whole, that doesn't mean that rock has that central agency. It just means that maybe there's a more complex system that does. And I'm actually a lot more
Yeah.
open to that sort of thing. But what I struggle with is the issue of like, I'll put it this way, I guess. It seems to me like I agree. You're naming the dynamics that have to come into play for there to be the kind of agency that we tend to be familiar with, which is this coordinated collection of things that come together and then have this sort of dynamic, holistic form of behavior in the world. But for me, then that kind of speaks to the emergentist answer to this issue, which is like, oh yeah, that's what you need to have agency, right? And if you don't have that coordination, then you just don't have it. You just have, and and I should also, I'm agnostic on this issue. Actually, I started out, well, let's say this. I used to be on the kind of panpsychist team, and then through some conversations and reading a bunch of things and the evolution of consciousness books, like, I got fairly comfortable with the emergentist account. So that's where I'm kind of sitting at the moment. But it won't, I mean, I'm open to either. And I'm, in some ways, there are obviously things that a panpsychist account helps resolve, even though it creates other issues. But
Mm-hmm.
so I'm open to that. But yeah, what do you make of that? I mean, it's like, it doesn't seem to really necessarily answer anything, as much as just kind of push back the issue an additional layer, into like, what is this agency thing? It seems to be presuming it rather than sort of explaining it.
I think agency at any scale is always distributed, right? And so we have these emergent wholes that display, we could say, more agency, but the agency of a human being is not something that is achieved inside the skin boundary. It's something that is achieved in concert with a whole society of other agents.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, we share a culture that affords and a language and institutions that afford us our agency. And so that's true of human beings, which, you think the human organism is among the most individuated systems in the entire universe, in the sense that it's able to exercise its autonomy in relation to an environment. But that autonomy is tightly bound up
Yeah,
and cognitively distributed through a whole society. And so
definitely.
I think that sort of, that all intelligence is collective intelligence, as Michael Levin likes to say, that goes all the way down and all the way up. And so instead of looking for like agency as something that would just emerge at this particular scale with this particular whole, there's always a nested, like, complex
Well, maybe you
hierarchy
could
that's.
describe that then. And let's not use a
Mhm.
rock, right? Because a rock would be a heap, not a hole. So let's talk about a
Yeah.
hole. And I think probably an atom is a good candidate for a very primordial or basal hole.
Mhm.
So I mean, can you try to put into words like what atomic agency, like, describe that a little bit, if it's possible?
Well, like, when I'm not a musician, but I enjoy music. But when you play notes and there's a certain feeling of joy that each note brings you, and then a chord and the emotion each chord produces, there's something like self-justifying about that feeling. And I would imagine the experience of atoms as you move up the periodic table, as you've got the proton and electron, and in the case of hydrogen, and then these various chordal structures that are allowed, that are like harmonious, where you get, electron shells and all the way up the table, right? Each one is a chord, and the vibratory pattern achieved is it has this intrinsic aesthetic justification to exist as it does. And Whitehead describes the history of the universe and the evolution of atoms as, in a very like biological way, as what had been sort of independently existing species of organism, or these enduring entities, protons, electrons, neutrons. They forged a symbiotic relationship so as to give rise to hydrogen and helium. And then before hydrogen and helium, I mean, the story we have that seems, I like it, seems true enough to me, is that we had to have stars form to produce heavier and explode to produce heavier elements. And there are other theories, though, that heavier elements can be produced through a galactic process. But it seems like there was this gradual. Well, it's gradual in some phases, but there's also punctuated equilibria where there's a breakthrough to a new, like when the first stars emerge, like that's new. Before there were just a bunch of hydrogen and helium atoms, and then all of a sudden you get stars. And so what does it feel like to be an atom? I mean, it feels like the closest analogy I think we have is to these musical analogies, in the way that there's this aesthetic justification to just continue to be in that sound, continue to be in that vibe, right?
So I would say, yeah, I mean, so where I'm very, I love Greg Enriquez's U-Talk framework. I think that does a lot. And people who know my work know that it draws a lot on his stuff, matter, life, mind, and culture. And I would agree with him. I'm comfortable saying that mind, the third level, goes down to like, worms and stuff, like planaria worms after like the Cambrian Revolution. You need some kind of a nervous system there, some kind of a multicellular thing where there's some information processing going on that's sort of relating an entity to its environment and taking information in and adjusting, doing some kind of intelligent, learning from that. And so that's like as far as I can go down conceptually. I could be like, there's definitely something, well, I shouldn't say definitely. I'm confident that there's something it's like to be a worm.
But not a plant.
But not a plant, right? And then, but because I think that it's a very helpful way of framing it, that you need an information processing system of a sufficient level of complexity to generate what we would think of as this emergent, phenomenon of consciousness. Now, even with at like the worm level, right? There's a really interesting way in which like you look at like cellular organisms interacting, and you can understand that kind of phenomena mechanically, and to some degree you can understand, there's a gradient here, and then when this interacts with this chemical, then it pushes it this way, and that sort of a thing. You can begin to do that sort of analysis, and that you could see as being kind of reflex driven learning, and you don't need consciousness to do that sort of a thing. If you certain things will just have a reflexive, adaptive response to something, and that's that essentially. But this consciousness thing seems to be a much more complex emergence based on compiling a whole bunch of those things together and getting this sort of valence structure. I don't know if you've read the book by Ginsberg and Jablonka. It's called The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. And I think that they make the case pretty coherently for this sort of framing of it, and Henriquez draws on them and a number of other folks who kind of see it very similarly. So like I can go there, I can see, like I could trace myself back and try to be like, there's something like, I'm a worm, and it's like I'm aware that there's I have experience, let's say, right? Like experience, I think, is going on there, but under that threshold, even a plant, as complex as they are, right, that you don't have the kind of information processing integration that would seem to go into what I tend to see as necessary for all the things that we talk about as experience. So it's a lot harder than to even begin to consider like the atomic level. Yeah. Well, and the last thing I'll say about that real quick is that still it seems like we're always going to be depending on, we're going to be leaning on our own anthropomorphic language, anthropocentric language, to be able to do this. And to some degree, that's, inevitable and unavoidable because we're humans and we're speaking from our perspective.
Mhm.
But like even like a chord and a music, satisfaction and all that, it's sort of like, yeah, but my whole sense of how all of that works is mediated through a complex nervous system that has valence, that is a product of evolutionary novelty. And so trying to read that back into something like an atom seems, I don't know, it's too much of a leap. So then part of it, maybe as a question, and I know you want to, I'll let you say your thing in a moment, or in a second, which is just that the question would be, is this issue something of a intuition? Like, do we just have to posit this axiomatically and then try to build from there, or is there any kind of argumentation that will sort of land as, if not convincing, at least very compelling, to sort of win the day in this argument of consciousness? But I'm sorry, you wanted to say something different first, so either answer that or whatever you wanted to say originally.
No, there's a lot of different places I could dive in, but I want to go back to the plant question and the nature of sentience first, I think, because I have drawn fruitfully, to use the appropriate metaphor, on the work of Michael Marder, who has developed a vegetal ontology, where he wants to. Much of his work has been to look at the history of Western philosophy and a little bit of Asian philosophy to see how plants have been treated by various philosophers. So like Aristotle, for example, you mentioned the sentient soul in Jablonka et al.'s book. It's kind of derived from this Aristotelian account of the fourfold nature of a human being, where we have this, we have a physical, we have a nutritive soul, we have a physical body, a nutritive soul, a sentient soul, and an intellectual or rational soul. And this idea to create these sorts of layerings obviously has an ancient pedigree. But the thing with like Aristotle's view of this would be that, famously his understanding of gravity would be that like heavy things fall to the earth because they kind of desire to be down there.
Right.
And so even his account of the physical world is already like panpsychist, basically. There's no mind matter division. There's a intrinsic purposiveness that drives nature from the physical on up through all these other layers of reality, right? So Aristotle has this very textured ontology, a layered ontology. And I think obviously any scientific approach that's not going to be reductionist is also going to have to develop some kind of a layered ontology.
Yeah, definitely.
And what Whitehead is saying is that if we're going to have a coherent metaphysics, we can't just have like four different kinds of reality that exist. Somehow the categories at the metaphysical level that we're employing to describe like human psychology, the same categories are going to, if we want a coherent metaphysics, and maybe we think metaphysics is dumb or impossible or not worthwhile or whatever, but if we want a coherent metaphysics, which means one set of categories that applies to everything, then however we describe human psychology, the same categories are also going to need to apply to physics. And Whitehead's not just taking our psychological experience and trying to force fit it to physics. He's a mathematical physicist who's driven to this pan-experiential view because of quantum theory, because of the complete demolition of this old mechanistic idea of simply located parts colliding with one another, obeying eternal laws that delivered from on high by some kind of deist creator. That idea Whitehead thought was no longer tenable, and so his sense that experience goes all the way down is related to his sense that, again, to go back to where we started with prehension, if you want a word that's not as loaded as like emotion or feeling or whatever, he gives you one. It's prehension, and his account of prehension is meant to be fully consistent with how physics describes energy vectors, right? And also fully consistent with how like psychologists are describing the stream of consciousness. And for Whitehead, it's like William James's psychology was the cutting edge account of that he was drawing on for the most part, but also fully consistent with how physiologists and biologists are describing the living world, right? One set of categories. Now, it could be that you have a different way of understanding what metaphysics is, or that maybe we should not be so concerned to have a coherent metaphysics. But for Whitehead, it's like general categories that apply across all of these scales. And I like to lean on the idea of a vegetal metaphor to understand how to bridge this gap between human cognition and like physical process. Because, I mean, there is at this point a pretty well established experimental science that we would, I think, have to call plant cognition. Plants can learn, they have memory, they respond to their environment in very sophisticated ways. And so you could say that all that can happen without experience. And I agree, animals with nervous systems certainly have more coordination to channel like information flows from the environment and pour that information into some central integrating node or what have you. Plants are much more distributed in their cognition, but they still seem to be agents.
Well, this is interesting. So I'm actually very keen on using the word learning. Like, I'm fine with talking about learning going across all scales.
Right.
And I'm writing a book basically that tries to make that case. And I think you can go all the way down to matter. Certainly you see it, in distributive systems of the basic idea of learning, which is basically entities sort of relating to their environment, the information of their environment in a way that is sort of let's say adaptive, broadly speaking. And it doesn't have to be biological adaptation. It can be, survival of the stable and universal Darwinism, the sort of like the things that can, continue to exist are what's sort of being, you could say, selected for, and they need to do that by relating themselves to the information of their environments. So I'm very happy to use that word. I reserve cognition for minded animal, nervous system things, but I think that we can talk about learning. So there might be a bridge there that could be a fruitful thing to sort of work out here. I was intrigued by your answer about time a minute ago, because it was sort of like, that's really cool, because on the one hand, there's definitely a temporal aspect to experience, certainly. But on the other hand, time, if someone were to ask me, what is time? Is it subjective or objective? I'd be inclined more to suggest that it is a kind of objective thing. And I know that can be challenged, I suppose, because even on the merits of Einstein's thought alone, that, we have a very subjective notion of time at our particular scale and all this stuff. And so that's different. But like, I guess what I'm getting at there is that in trying to home in on like this sort of non-anthropocentric basal essence of prehension, using a word like time to get at that, it seems to be then shifting that, I guess you could say, shifting the conversation from that upper left quadrant into the upper right sort of a thing, or from left to right.
Yeah. And I totally get why it would seem that way, because Einstein won in terms of the reception of that exchange with Bergson. Like the popular culture and the intellectual culture says Einstein won, which is to say time is a measurable objective quantity. Time is, for the purpose of physics, just what the clocks measure. And we have to coordinate clocks in this weird way that Einstein allows for, which confounds our direct experience of it. Yeah. But I think we have to, there have been a number of books and conferences revisiting that debate, because it has such profound worldview consequences,
right?
And geopolitical consequences when you put it in historical context, between the world wars and Bergson's role in trying to get nations to cooperate, and how Einstein was involved in.
But it's interesting, though. It's interesting because I think you could use the same Einsteinian argument to actually argue the opposite position as well. I mean, I think of the movie Interstellar, right? Which is this whole thing where, Matthew McConaughey is going into space, and then they're looking for these planets that can sustain life. And then, the one has huge gravity, more gravity than Earth. It's like you go down there for a minute, but then actually relative to other people, you've been down there for years. So it's all Einsteinian relativity theory, but it's interesting because it seems to foreground the fundamentally subjective nature of time rather than its objective nature, right? Like presumably the objective nature would be sort of invariant across observers, but the fact that it is observer dependent would seem to kind of favor a subjective interpretation of time. I don't know what you'd make of that.
I think these are vexing issues, but
Yeah.
if I were Bergson, I think what he would point out is, like, in a film like Interstellar, there's an underlying presupposition of the duration of the audience watching the film. The stream of consciousness of the audience watching the film, where all of these temporal distortions are happening, is presupposed. And we can't really make sense of the temporal distortions going on in the context of that world that's being fantasized about, except because we have the narrative continuity of our own duration.
That's interesting.
And so, I mean, Bergson's whole point is that clocks measure something, but it's not time. Clocks measure space, really. They measure motion. And they allow us to coordinate our activities in practical ways. But time itself, is something that we live through. Like just considering that clocks themselves, the instruments we use to measure what we usually call time, clocks are aging. And so you need, in other words, they're falling out of sync. And so you need another clock to make sure that clock is in sync. And then you have an infinite regress of clocks trying to make sure that the clock is right. And so whatever it is that time's, if you want to call it its objective nature, it's, in some ways, that is what I'm saying. Time has an objective nature, but not as a quantity that could be measured. It's qualitative. Time has a objective quality.
Well, take us forward a little bit in the chain then. And by the way, I mean, I find this fascinating because I would not have thought that a conversation about prehension and the basis of consciousness at a fundamental level would center around this issue of time. So that's fascinating, and I'll have to give some thought to that. But I also know that it can be sometimes unhelpful to just sort of look at the polarities. Like we've got our very complex consciousness, and then we're like, well, what's the most basic form? And we're talking now at like this very abstract level in some ways, right? But then talk about a plant. I mean, what's the prehensive nature of plant experience? As you might try to give words to that.
I mean, if you observe plants in their daily movements, I mean, they move quite a bit. They don't move as quickly as animals, but now that we have time-lapse photography, it's quite easy to see and appreciate the way that the plants prehend the sun and respond to the sun, not just daily but seasonally. And prehension is again, it's a metaphysical category that allows us to describe various more specific processes like photosynthesis, which can be described in great molecular detail and biochemical detail, but also just the ways that the self-organizing dynamics of a plant are bound up in a metabolism that involves the soil and the fungi in the soil, and that like prehension is an attempt to describe how boundaries are constantly being crossed while also being maintained, right? And so Whitehead has positive prehensions and negative prehensions in his account, right? And it's like the whole point of doing metaphysics for Whitehead is to have these terms that we can apply fruitfully to understand biological processes just as much as physical processes, just as much as psychological processes. But I mean, the most obvious example of prehension in in the case of a plant would be the way that they track. I mean, watch a sunflower track the sun. That's prehension.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting though, because for me, there's such a semantic slippage that a word like prehension seems to allow for, right? Because
By
when you say,
design.
yeah, I suppose so, right? Which I guess could be helpful or, potentially
Well, what
just
is metaphysics? I mean, I don't want to interrupt if you're going
no, no,
somewhere
no.
else, but what it says metaphysics is basically, he thinks it can be a science, and like all sciences, it has instruments that it experiments with, and for Whitehead, metaphysics experiments with the instrument of language itself.
Mm.
Um, and we're searching for generalities that apply across all domains of experience.
Yeah, though it's also interesting to me too, because it seemed like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like Whitehead's metaphysical, like ultimate primals, one of them was novelty, right? And so there's this notion that I also want to, in honoring Whitehead, I suppose, was something that I value a lot about the novelty aspect, the process aspect, this approach to reality as organism, is that there's change and there's novelty and development and unfolding, right? And so as much as we might look for metaphysical constants that can hold across vast scales and differences, we also want to honor the differences that that emerge out of that novelty. And so that to me just seems to be the downside to projecting something like consciousness, or let's just say experience, granting maybe that consciousness is a very kind of complex form of this prehensive experience. When we project that all the way down, we seem to be sort of abandoning the notion of its novelty and its emergent kind of uniqueness at a particular scale, and that has all sorts of potential downsides besides even just purely conceptual. So I think you could also try to make a good case for preserving the uniqueness of the subjective realm at the highly complex level, in a way that sort of is in the spirit of, I think, also a Whiteheadian sort of process thought. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I take to heart what you said about the concern with having some like fixed set of metaphysical categories, given that novelty is so important. How could one set of categories apply indefinitely if we can't predict the future, and there's just open-ended unfolding? And this is, Whitehead's actually quite there's a lot of humility in Process and Reality when he talks about how, look, I'm not actually sure anything I'm saying here is properly metaphysical. It could be that in the sense that it would apply to what he calls cosmic epochs, all cosmic epochs, because he's like, look, all the laws of physics that we have described so far are almost certainly contingent, limited to this cosmic epoch. There may be other cosmic epochs wherein totally different laws apply, because the evolution of each universe is going to go in different directions. And he doesn't think of laws as just eternally imposed. Laws are emergent habits.
Yeah.
Right. And so he's very cautious about the extent to which he's even arrived at anything truly metaphysical, but he has an intuition that there's something about, and this is the more technical aspects of Process and Reality, where he develops what's called the Mariotopology. Like, there's something about the relationship between wholes and parts that he thinks is like logically fundamental in a sense, that would have to apply across all universes, across all cosmic epochs. That would be a whole nother conversation. But I think your point is well taken, and I think, like I said earlier, the idea that consciousness is emergent in Whitehead's own terms, when he defines consciousness as a very high grade form of experience, to use his language, it is emergent from highly organized biological.
Well, let's zoom in on that. That would be clarifying as well, because I'd love to hear you talk about what you do see as being emergent or genuinely novel forms of prehension. I do want to say first, though, I wanted to mention this when we were talking about time, because I found it really fascinating. I was recommended by Troy Complin, and rest in peace, this book called Time, Conflict, and Human Values by J.T.
Mm.
Frazier. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it, but or maybe
Yeah.
maybe you definitely have heard of it.
A student of mine just mentioned it to me recently,
Oh,
actually. Yeah,
interesting.
that's funny.
I really enjoyed it, and one of the basic ideas is that time itself evolves, or that time at different scales is a different sort of phenomenon. So when you go down to the quantum level, like time doesn't, it operates in a very different way. You go up anyway, so I'd recommend that, because I am also intrigued by the notion that sometimes what we take to be these physical constants, even physical laws, I think that we probably would do well to consider the variability and the evolving nature of those things as well. Whether habit is the best word to use, this is its own kind of conversation, but at the very least, that things that seem sort of unified, like time and space, that actually might have emergent levels, you could say, as you go up or down the stack. I wanted to just name that, but yeah, so to kind of go the opposite direction with this, instead of drilling down into try to describe the basal nature of prehension, what would you say are some important thresholds to identify in the emergence of novelty in a prehensive universe?
Mm. Well, I mean, the way that Whitehead distinguishes consciousness is it's a late phase in very special, in the concrescence of very special occasions of experience. And it arises when you get a certain complex arrangement of prehensions where you have I'm going to use Whitehead's terminology here, and then we can unpack it. And you get a contrast. Whenever you have a conscious occasion of experience, it's because there's a contrast between something physically prehended, meaning it's something physically present in the environment of that occasion. That feeling is contrasted with a conceptual feeling or a conceptual prehension of an alternative possibility of what is not given in perception, let's say. And so it's a contrast between what is and what could be. And Whitehead calls this the affirmation negation contrast. And that, for him, produces consciousness. And you can have lower and higher intensities of consciousness. And he talks about degrees to which an occasion of experience can be irradiated by consciousness as a result of these types of contrasts. The vast majority of occasions of experience aren't complex enough for that type of contrast to arise. And it's only in conscious occasions of conscious occasions of experience that you get judgments of true and false and things like that. He also he refers to intellectual feelings as a synonym for what he means by consciousness. And even among human beings, conscious experience is quite rare. Usually, we are just engaged in more or less habit-bound, routinized behavior, and in fact, in many senses, like when we're driving, if we're too conscious, we're not going to be very, very good drivers. Actually, it's quite dangerous to be attending to this affirmation negation contrast. I mean, you want to have a little bit of that, but it's like, this difference between spotlight and floodlight. Most of the time, when we're in any kind of even minimal flow experience, we're not conscious in the way that Whitehead means it specifically.
Well, it almost sounds though like his use of the word conscious is more like what I would call like reflective consciousness, or like self-consciousness or something like that.
Sure.
And I mean, this is where these things become really difficult, because even in consciousness studies and people studying this,
no shared definition.
there's just all this, a slippage of ideas and sentience and consciousness and all this stuff. Because I would say that humans are always minimally conscious, but I would definitely say that there are degrees of self-reflexive or just, and that doesn't have to be reflection on the self, but there's a reflective awareness and attentional, depth or something like that.
There's his experiential horizon for sure. Yeah. I mean, definitely. But it's like this is a challenge that has been, raised in response to Whitehead's thought quite frequently. And
Hmm.
so I'm convinced that there's a way of understanding what a non-conscious experience, what it means to say that. But it has not been easy for me to communicate it effectively, to
Well, let me
convince
do
those
something
who,
very mean to you, which is
okay.
to try to use your own ideas against you. No, but to
Okay.
try no to try to bring back some of our previous conversation in a way that would, you know, shake some of this up, right?
Mhm.
Which is basically, one of the things I think for good reason that you call out in so much science and model building and abstraction is the alienation that occurs from our lived reality to then using these abstract terms and concepts that then talk about things that actually aren't in our immediate awareness
Mhm.
and perception and ability to conceive of.
Yeah.
So I guess my kind of mean question would be, well, isn't there something like that going on with like unconscious experience? If we can't kind of intuitively get that, but have to like kind of turn ourselves into pretzels to try to articulate that idea, doesn't that kind of speak against the conceptual clarity and reality of an idea like that?
Well, I mean, potentially. I mean, it's an empirical question in a way. I guess we'll find out. I'll keep trying, and
Well, I mean,
if it doesn't work,
I don't have the issue as much with the abstraction and the models because I'm okay with there being truths that don't fit our perceived reality. But that was sort of
yeah.
the
I
thing you were
thought you were going
exploring.
to throw a harder critique at me, which is that isn't Whitehead's metaphysics a pretty abstract model that
Well,
doesn't
that would
seem to
be
be?
sort of the implication from a lot of this stuff. But I mean, again, I also don't have a problem with jargon. I'm cool with the abstract models, right? It's like
Mhm.
if when you're really trying to drill down into the fundamental nature of reality, I don't expect it to like come as naturally as saying there's a blue sky and whatnot, right? So, but it is, I guess, interesting if you're going to try to make both cases simultaneously, that like you're calling that into question, but also having to use a very elaborate, abstract, and unintuitive set of ideas in order to explain why that is the case. There might be something circular there.
It seems to me that there are many other examples of thinkers who try to describe something similar with slightly different terms, like Jung or depth psychology generally, talking about unconscious complexes and archetypes
Yeah.
that have their own. It's like really, when you get down to it, Jung's account of the structure of the psyche is that it's composed of these autonomous archetypal complexes. Each one has its own kind of consciousness,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and the ego thinks that it's the only conscious archetype, but it's just one among a whole collective of consciousnesses, right? And whatever the self would be some kind of um, uh, transpersonal harmonization of these various sub agencies or something. But and I think biologists and physiologists are always thinking in terms of modes of experience, sentience, agency that are not conscious. Like,
Right. Right.
um, I don't think Michael Levin thinks single cells are like self-reflective or anything,
Right.
but
And again, I'm fine with talking about unconscious learning, which might sound
mm,
odd to people, but I think
uh,
if you have a kind of right quadrant side description of what you mean by learning, I feel like, then it becomes more legit.
I mean, one way out of this impasse with the multitude of definitions of consciousness is just to like be a little bit stricter about our etymology and the
Mm-hmm.
history of this word and how it comes out of like conscience. And I mean, I think it was actually the Cambridge Platonists, like Cudworth and others, who first used consciousness in something like the modern sense.
Hmm.
Um, but it was related to conscience originally. It came out of French, and like that obviously has more of a moral and ethical
Mm-hmm.
meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But the root has always been um, like science or knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and so consciousness implies knowledge, right? And so if when someone wants to say consciousness goes all the way down, like I kind of hesitate and resist that,
Mm.
even though like I have been going around calling myself a panpsychist. I don't like that way of phrasing it
Yeah.
because of the word. I think the best we could do is really tie back to this etymology and use consciousness properly instead of just as a. I mean, everyone has their own technical definition of it, but
Mm.
like let's just put it back in its historical context and understand it as meaning knowledge. And obviously that doesn't go all the way down. Knowledge is something that language using
See, this is so interesting, actually,
primates have.
because I would actually be much more inclined to say that something like knowledge goes all the way down rather than.
I thought I was helping. I'm making it worse. Okay.
No, it's great. It's great. I mean, I agree with you though, that, well, what I'd really love to see, honestly, is I'd love to see Matt Segall's sort of what words you think could be a meaningful map of the emergent, sort of evolution of prehension slash into consciousness over time. Like, what cluster of words do you find appropriate to apply to, say, a molecule, and then what do you feel like are only appropriate to apply to a plant or an animal, and so on? That would be, I mean, fascinating, because for me, this whole conversation, as well as this whole podcast, really has been about, I guess, ultimately the evolution of consciousness, and that idea as a framing device for thinking about meaning and spirituality. And so just to kind of make another meta connection there.
Yeah.
I wanted to, so I mean, we should probably wrap up soonish, and I have one question for you that I'd love to get to, but I didn't want to cut you off if there was something you wanted to bring in there.
Well, I know you started by asking, like, encouraging me to offer my thoughts, and not just trying to speak for Whitehead or whatnot. But, when you ask what my names for the various levels would be, I think it's, on the one hand, it's tempting to come up with my own account of that and my own terminology, but there's so many historical examples of thinkers trying to do this. And it's like, maybe later in my life, I'll want to create my own theory of everything or whatever. But at this point, it's just like, well, there's lots to build on here. And I mean, I think like someone like Schelling, in the late 1790s, develops this account of, an original polarity between gravity and light, and then electricity and magnetism, and then sensibility and irritability were his terms. And like, you begin to get the movement from what appears to be mechanical to something chemical to something or organic. But it's like an unfolding of something that was already infolded. But what Schelling ends up saying is that, like, sensibility and irritability, which is almost like what we would say nowadays, like the sensory motor capacity, this call and response dynamic goes all the way down. Like, that's the nature of energetic interaction at every scale.
Yeah.
There's an information processing is another phrase that we could use here.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I think there's just so many wonderful schemes that have been offered to account for that why would I convolute things further by using another set of terms that would be laid on top of this?
Well, a couple thoughts come to mind, though, is that one is, I mean, you've read deeply in a bunch of these different thinkers. So, building a theory of everything, a Segallian theory of everything would be really interesting to try to integrate across those different inspirations and sets of knowledge to try to put some of that together. I mean, obviously Wilbur does something like that, but I think you do make a good point that maybe in his reading of Whitehead, it's a little bit not ideal. So maybe you could, offer something a little bit more corrective for that. But the other thing I was going to say is, I think actually you might have been the one kind of trying to keep folks honest, I suppose you could say, about the nature of information. I'm trying to remember what the context was, but this word information gets thrown around a lot, and it does a lot of work sometimes. But like some of these really fundamental notions like energy, it's very hard for even physicists or scientists to give, coherent and consistent definitions for. And so you've got a lot of complexity stuff talking about information, and people are sort of okay with that because it does seem to do something similar to what prehension does, which is sort of straddle the subjective objective kind of divide. And I think that it becomes really difficult to try to get much greater clarity about all this. And obviously, it's probably one of the grandest philosophical questions that there is. So it's quite a daunting task. And by the question, I mean, essentially, what is the relationship between the subject and the object? And, not just a philosophical question, obviously, either, but also I think a profoundly spiritual one too, because it's also, that issue is the heart of mysticism itself. And in some ways, finding a way either to dissolve or integrate that perceived binary is also the goal of kind of spiritual non-dual insight and enlightenment, etc. So there's a lot going on there, and I feel like to the extent that we're all kind of building the cathedral, trying a go at trying to answer that one is good. I try to do that a little bit in a preliminary way in the emergentism book, but there's obviously it's still very much a mystery. But the question I was going to ask to begin to kind of close this up a little bit is I wonder sometimes if it's a little bit of a red herring or overstating the case that this is really that important of an issue when you consider how much we probably both do agree on and how much emergentists and panpsychists probably agree on, right? In the sense that I think you and I and those two groups of folks would both say that as you increase in complexity, you get a shift in kinds of prehension or interiority, basically. That like, you would acknowledge that there's a unique, as Whitehead does, that there's a unique thing called consciousness that like is kind of rare, and that's something that like humans do, and that doesn't go all the way down. And that there are probably a graded set of those sorts of things that like worms are probably having different kinds of prehensive experiences than molecules, right? So at a certain point, the question becomes like, what is the utility in the conversation if that sort of is the gist of it, right? If there is some kind of insight that we can agree that as things complexify, this sort of interiority deepens and grows towards consciousness, and that at the base of this, there's something so kind of primordial that to speak in terms of consciousness or subjectivity even is sort of like almost an imposition and an anthropomorphic kind of violence to what's going on there. It's almost like have we evaporated the very essence of the thing? Do you see what I'm saying? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think in conversations like this where it's a bit of a struggle to disagree with each other, by which I mean the nuances are so fine that it's like, well, is this even an important disagreement? And I'm not sure. Our viewers will have to tell us, and let us know what they think has been accomplished, if anything, thus far in these exchanges. But I think getting clearer on the work we're trying to get these different terms to do is an important task. I like these information theoretic approaches, but that's because I think they imply a kind of pan-experientialism or pan semiosis, if we want to go in that. I mean, there's different, there's the Charles Saunders Peirce way of doing this all the way down kind of thing, and then there's the Whitehead way of doing this all the way down kind of thing. Both are, I think, adjacent to what these information processing accounts that whether it's Greg Enriquez or Bobby Zarian are developing. I think that's the direction I'd want things to go. And those are the people I want to be in dialogue with, because there's a convergence happening there. And I think, to connect back to the original impetus for this latest series of conversations about scientific models, I think it's very easy in the popular imagination nowadays to think that the difference between speculative philosophy or metaphysics and science, natural science, is that the difference is that, well, the philosophers really need to take a back seat at this point because science tells us what the truth is and what's really going on. And I want to pay very close attention to science, but the problem is that the Bruno Latour used to distinguish between ready-made science and science in the making. And I very much want to stay abreast of science in the making.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of ready-made science, which I think the Big Bang Theory is the poster child for, that makes us think that the universe is this finished product and that we now know how it works. And there's plenty that I think we do know, and that philosophers, metaphysicians need to keep in mind when trying to, exercise imagination in pursuit of if not answers to the big questions, then at least the proper way of orienting to those questions.
Yeah.
That I think we want to pay attention to science, but not be so hemmed in by it that we begin to worship the models. Right?
Yeah.
I want to build a cathedral too, but I think I don't want there to be this foregone conclusion that we're building a cathedral within a model of a universe, that we really want to be in touch with the actual universe and see ourselves as participants within it, and that like our the freedom and the creativity that we seek to express is part of this unfinished creation, right? The universe is not finished. It's in the making, and we're a part of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like the cathedral is not just the, oh, we made the best model. It's the model making. It's the asking the questions. It's the philosophizing, really. It's the, and that includes always questioning your presuppositions that are going into your model making. And
it's a cathedral that's a studio, an art studio, and a laboratory, scientific laboratory. It's like, all of these things.
I mean, Kuhn said, didn't he, that when scientific paradigms are beginning to fail, and that they look to philosophy, essentially, inevitably. And, I think maybe it's Storm actually in his book makes the opposite point that as well, that is also true, which is that when philosophy is sort of not doing its job, then it looks to science and just sort of says, hey, look, there it is. So I think they are, they both inform each other, and we shouldn't conflate what they're both doing, and certainly shouldn't just say, let the philosophers get out of the room so the scientists can do the real work here. I think that'd be awful. I do think that folks like you and others who are really asking these kinds of really meaningful questions are doing a kind of philosophy that we don't see enough. And so people tend to conflate philosophy with a certain kind of academic, esoteric, abstruse thing that doesn't really seem to speak to the big questions in a way that sometimes people feel like the scientific breakthroughs do, in terms of updating our worldview and changing our lived reality and whatnot. And I don't know, my academic philosopher friends might get mad at me for saying so, but also probably would agree. Yeah, I think that was all I wanted to say on that. Before we close up, anything you'd want to add to this conversation and or posit as another thing that you would feel would warrant such a extensive excavation? It's funny too. I mean, we've spent an hour and a half, and I feel like we still also are only starting to get into the depths of these sorts of issues.
Well, I mean, just as a gesture towards maybe the next conversation, we've been talking a lot about science. I wonder if we might have something interesting to explore together around religion. And I know you've written a bit about, like, before we started recording, I mentioned I read the part of Emergentism about Whitehead and Teilhard, and I wrote a paper for a conference recently that will be part of some book comparing Whitehead and Teilhard, probably next year, that's called Process Theology in the Modern World, and just trying to understand how Whitehead and Teilhard can help us bring religion back in a scientifically, in a way that's compatible with science, and that can address some of these larger meaning crisis issues. Because I know you care about that too, and maybe
very much so. I could see getting into a little bit of the question around teleology. I think could be a fascinating thing to excavate. And again, I mean, this issue, as I said a little while ago, around prehension and the whole subject object split and all of that, I feel like it is at the core also of kind of human mysticism as a very different way to explore, I think, the same fundamental issue, and maybe even resolve it more successfully, potentially. So I could see this conversation very naturally going into into that side of the conversation. But I'd be happy to. We can chat more about where we might want to pick up with any of this, and see what people would be interested also to dive more into. And But this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time as always. And I will spend some time reflecting on time and prehension, and a lot of the things that came out of this for me. It's good to, I'll marinate in and we'll come back to. But cool. Well, Matt Segall, again, thanks so much. And until next time, appreciate it.
Thanks, Brendan.